Once we have a solid understanding of CPI and inflation rate, we're going to step into the second half of this chapter and talk about the effects of inflation, which will give us the difference between nominal and real values. Okay? Now here, let's start with the definitions. Nominal value means it's expressed in dollar amount, okay, and the current dollars. And the real value means the purchasing power of your money. Okay? And mathematically, we can figure out the relationship with this formula. Okay, so the real values equals the nominal value divided by the measure of price levels and multiplied by 100%. Okay, now once we divide it by the measure of the price levels, we would be able to squeeze out the inflationary impact. Okay, so what's left over would be the real values. Here we're going to use two examples to show you the difference between nominal and real values. The first one is real GDP versus nominal GDP. In the second one, which we're going to discuss in the next video, would be the real wage versus nominal wage. Okay. Now here we start with the real versus nominal GDP because back in chapter 10, we already knew how to calculate both of them, right? So you should already been quite familiar with this. Now here, we plug in the numbers, the variables into the general formula we just mentioned, right? So the real values here would be real GDP. The nominal values would be nominal GDP. The measure of price levels, which one we're supposed to plug in here? Are we going to do CPI? What could be the problems if we put CPI over there as the denominator? Pause the video and think about it. Now, the real GDP and nominal GDP here, it covers all goods and services we produced, right? If we put the CPI down here as a numerator, as a denominator, you got to remember CPI covers only consumption goods and services. Here, you would find that there's a mismatch in terms of the goods and services covered. Okay, the numerator covers everything produced on the U.S. territory. If we're talking about the U.S. Nominal GDP, and the CPI here covers only consumption goods and services, right? So here we got introduced another price indicator. It's called GDP Deflator. What we're doing is mathematically, here we move the question mark to the left-hand side of the equation, and we move the real GDP to the right-hand side. So we will get GDP deflator equals nominal GDP divided by real GDP multiplied by 100%. Okay. Here, deflator is a statistical factor designed to remove the effect of inflation. All right. Now, once again, we will be able to do this simply because back in chapter 10, we already knew how to calculate nominal and real GDP. Okay, so once we get the historical price and quantity information and the current price and quantity, we will be able to figure out these two, right? So the ratio will give us the GDP deflator. All right. Now, to better show you the difference between nominal and real GDP, we pick a sample period of 3 decades, okay, from 1981 to 2011, and we take 1981 as the base year. That's why here you see the real GDP shown in the red area, and the nominal GDP shown in this green area, they are equal in 1981 because that is the base year. Okay, so in the base year, nominal and real GDP are equal. Over this course of 3 decades, if we simply focus on nominal GDP to figure out how quickly the US economy has been growing, you would find that in 1981, the GDP was below $4 trillion. In 2011, it's close to $16 trillion. In other words, the size of the US economy has been growing about 4 times. Okay. However, a portion of this growth in output is because of the increase in prices. Okay, so if we focus on the real GDP, we find that in 2011 it's below $8 trillion. So the real size of our economy has grown about 100% over this course of 3 decades. Okay, much smaller than what nominal GDP suggested. Okay, and on your right hand side, we use a different way, use a balloon to show you that. Once again, here, the bigger one is the nominal GDP, and the smaller one is the orange one is the real GDP. Okay, we find the orange one is smaller simply because we already squeezed out the inflation. Okay. On this slide, I pull out a Fred chart to show you, over a wider sample period or a longer sample period. Okay, what happens to our real versus nominal GDP? And the blue line here is a GDP, gross domestic product. It is nominal. Okay, sometimes when we say nominal variables, we do not explicitly say it's nominal. Okay, we're assuming it is nominal. Now, the red one is a real, so here you can find this R word. We want to emphasize that this is after the inflation adjustment. Okay. Of course, the gap in between represent the inflation, okay, or the impact of inflation. Now here, I want to leave 2 questions for you guys to think about. Okay, the first one is in the year 2012, we find these 2 curves intersect. What does that mean? Is that just a coincidence, or there might be some economic intuition behind this intersection? Okay. The second question is, we find that after 2012, nominal GDP stands above real GDP, but before 2012, real GDP stands above nominal GDP. How so? Why? We find the real GDP becomes larger than the nominal before 2012. Okay? Again, during our virtual meeting, we can talk about this. Here, we already got 2 price indicators. The first one is CPI. The second one is GDP deflator. Okay. Now, I pull out the Fred chart showing you the evolution of these 2 indicators. Okay. We go from the 1960s all the way to the most recent years. Okay. And once again, the shaded areas, the gray ones, are the recessions. Okay. Here you find that across the board, these 2 are actually moving hand by hand. Okay, at least most of the time. They're moving towards the same direction, about the same magnitude. Okay, and but there are some differences here. Okay, so we're going to talk about the differences, or we're trying to have a good understanding of which one between the 2 is better. Okay, now The difference is here we have three of them. The first one is the weights. Okay, remember when we look at the CPI, we use the fixed market basket, right? The same goods and services, the same quantities, so the weights are fixed. But when we calculate the GDP deflator, we use nominal GDP divided by real, right? When we calculate nominal and real GDPs, we use actual amount or actual quantity of goods and services produced. So they are changing year by year. Okay, that's why we said this is a GDP deflator has a changing weights. It's not constant over time. Okay, it's not fixed. The second difference is when we look at the CPI, we said it covers consumption goods and services we spend money on, but we did not say it has to be produced within the US territory. So it could be produced anywhere. For example, if many of us purchase a German beer, and that thing would go into our the CPI fixed market basket. But it was produced in Germany, right? So the CPI will cover that. GDP deflator, it has to be produced domestically, okay? Because when we calculate the real versus nominal GDP, we include only US made goods and services. So this is the second difference between these two. Okay. Here I would like to bring up to your attention that our discussion does not suggest that GDP deflator must have a larger, a broader coverage than CPI, because in the GDP deflator we do cover other things other than the consumption goods and services, right? So we do have the government purchases, we have the investment, we have the exports. But remember, for CPI, it covers, as we said, all of these imported goods which we spend money on. Okay, so there are part of this CPI covered goods and services which are not included in the coverage of GDP deflator. Okay. The third difference between these two is the CPI covers the goods and services bought by consumers, but GDP deflator covers all goods and services produced, as we already mentioned. Okay. Once again, the good news for us is for most of the time you would find that they are moving towards the same direction. Okay, and the CPI is more volatile than GDP deflator. Okay. Here I want to leave with you another question. You could find that, for example, in 1970s, in early 1980s, you would find that the CPI shoots up much higher than GDP deflator, especially here from late 1970s to early 1980s. Okay, in other words, if we're looking at the inflation, the CPI will suggest a much higher inflation rate than GDP deflator. Why? Okay, how there could be such a huge gap between these two in a certain historical periods like this? Okay, the clue I can give you is you can think about what happened during that period of time in history. Okay, specifically, there are two crises in 1970s. What crisis? How the crisis affected CPI and GDP deflator in a different way. All right, we're going to talk about this during our virtual meeting.